All right. Thank you. Does everyone see my screen? All right. Thanks for having me today. Really excited to be here and really excited around this entire theme. I'm always happy to get the opportunity to share my nerdy interests, which are shared with others. So today I'm going to talk a bit about Delve and Andres gave a bit of this intro, but yeah, I'm have been teaching at Columbia in urban analytics and ambient computing, and have also been advising on a new master's program that just started this summer called Computational Design Practices. Just want to say I'm really excited about this emerging field and the potential for what it can really do across industries. So I'm sure there's a lot of folks in this room that are starting to dive into this type of work. Maybe you're even actively working professionally in this field, and super eager and curious to hear what you all kind of, how you see it shaping up. And then I also co-organize this group called Architecties. It's got a very active Slack community, and basically, other than having an adorable name, is a group of folks like computational designers, folks interested in prop tech, in spatial technologies. Sometimes it's software engineers that are interested in mapping and data. So just a really nice cross-disciplinary environment for this emerging field of spatial and urban tech. And then, of course, today I'll talk about Delve, where I'm a senior product manager, and has been just to share a bit about this strange overlap of architecture and technology. I actually started out as an architect and switched roles into being a product manager. And so it's been really interesting for me to see the world from both of these sides, from having done a lot of master plans myself, working in a more computational design role, and then starting to think about things through the business side, and what does someone really want? And how do we think about the multiple stakeholders involved? So that's been very interesting. So Delve is part of Google's initiative to drive urban innovation and sustainability. So one thing that's been really amazing and a little bit of a dream come true is our product Delve and Sidewalk Labs working with Google. So we are actually under their sustainability arm, under Geo, which is their where Google Maps is. So it's been really interesting to just see all the potential of working so closely with all of the knowledge and expertise that already exists, even in the field of urban analytics within Google. Delve's mission is to radically improve quality of life through holistic, quantitative, and transparent urban design. So what does that really mean? So when we think about holistic urban design, that means thinking about not just what is trying to build the most units on the site or just what's most financially viable. It means actually understanding how many of those units are affordable. It means understanding the walkability and daylight. And so one thing that's really important for us is how can we understand the whole picture? Maybe not even just understanding the impact of a single building or development, but what is the impact on the whole neighborhood? Really understanding development through a quantitative lens. So it's not just the best rendering that gets built, not just whichever development has the best lens flare. It's really like, how can we quantitatively assess and look at many different design options to assess which one's best? And transparent really meaning, how can we audit and understand, and this goes to the point around quantitative as well, is sometimes development can be a bit obscure. You might see that something moves forward or gets developed because the loudest person in the room said, this is something we have to develop. Or you might not know why an architect or a developer pushed forward a particular design, like what were their incentives behind it. And so one thing that's really important to us is not only evaluating various metrics that are more holistic and objective or quantitative, it's really trying to make transparent what was the rationale behind why these designs were chosen, or why was this strategy better than this one, so that we can be more clear about why a particular design was chosen. So we've worked with a lot of developments already, 17 countries and counting, on various types of site sizes. So all the way up to 1,000 acres, but in some instances, even projects as small as a single tower. So a lot of the development challenges that exist today really exist in that early phase. So those early stage challenges is when the development is really most plastic. You're setting down roads, you're deciding what are the use types and how much gross square footage am I going to develop here. You're trying to decide whether a tower or a big development is going to be on one side of the site versus the other. Once you break ground and shovels are in the ground, it's really hard to move things around. So one thing that we can really help with is to automatically look at a wide spectrum of possible scenarios, test out hundreds of designs that are all very different, so that we can just de-risk and assess, does it make sense to pack the development on this side of the site, or actually does it make sense to spread it out and have pocket parks throughout, or is it actually best if these parks are linear and the development has a different strategy? So those are really big, expensive moves to make or change later on. So we try and really look at those scenarios really early. So we look at this from many different facets. We look at the financial, we look at regulatory like zoning, from a sustainability lens, and quality of life, which has a number of metrics packed within that. But really with the intention of getting to the highest and best use for a site. Are folks familiar with this term, highest and best use? Something that I became more familiar with through working with Delve and development, but really it's oftentimes developers are trying to understand what is the best use for the site that I'm going to develop. And that means like, what is the right use types for this site? What will the market handle? What is its full potential of this site, basically? And so we try and do that very quickly in minutes. I just think back to when I was working in architecture and development, and when we would do master planning projects, there was a big kind of waterfall handoff method. Someone would sketch out a few possible designs based on what the developer wanted, and then you'd hand it off to someone who would do a cost model in Excel, and they would say, oh, actually, that doesn't work. What if we try? Can we change around the gross square footage for this use type? And then someone would have to remodel and see if that actually fit on the site. And then someone else would have to do like a day, like it was just very back and forth. So we couldn't ever make those back out. We couldn't like back out and just see those trade-offs and have those high level conversations about what are really the best strategies for the site and what levers are there here. So that's what we really try and do. All right, I'm going to play a short video.
Delve is a product for development teams that generates hundreds of designs in minutes. Every single design option integrates a financial model customized to you. That means you can see how different designs, building massings, program mixes, or unit sizes will impact returns, enabling you to meaningfully weigh the financial impact of each design from the start. This feature has saved our customers significant amounts of time and carry costs. Let's delve deeper into a design generated by Delve. Here, the developer was looking for a diverse yet profitable program mix. And you can see what Delve has recommended in terms of the number of residential, commercial, retail, and community spaces. Delve can also visualize other details of the site, such as the apartment type breakdown. Delve can perform sophisticated parking analyses. It can show the site's projected greenhouse gas emissions, too. Request access now at sidewalklabs.com/Delve. Delve. Discover better designs today. Delve.
All right. So there are three big ways in which Delve is currently working, or use cases that we support. So one is the highest and best use. That was somewhat what I was describing. The other is generating many different spatial master plan concepts. So helping urban design teams really understand what are the various scenarios for the site. And then evaluating benchmark designs. So oftentimes we might jump in and a development team might be pretty far along in their process, and they just want to assess the performance of that particular design. So we can also upload existing designs and assess them for these criteria. And so that criteria being, things like assessing the yield and program. So oftentimes an important aspect of what development teams do is try and identify the program mix. They're trying to identify unit counts, parking counts, get a sense of what actually fits on the site, taking into account the design priorities. So these are constraints, so existing zoning regulations and existing setbacks that are required for the site. And then we actually evaluate and optimize for these metrics. You see these three metrics: the quality of life, financial outcomes, and sustainability outcomes. So once we generate many possible designs, we generate batches of designs, but then evaluate them for the performance of these various aspects. So we can evaluate which ones do best for views, which ones are best for walkability, which ones are best for capital value, which ones are best for things like GHG. And so this can help us get a better, almost take like a statistical approach to the development process, look at all the possible options and see the trade-offs between them. So just to give a quick overview of what this looks like in practice, this was a project we worked on in the UK, where one of the really important things to this development team, they were working with an urban design firm and were actually relatively far along. You see the original massing scheme in the lower left-hand corner. And they needed to, as many cities face housing shortages, one of the main things you need to do is find ways to develop more on small sites. But you also need to really ensure you are maintaining a certain quality of life. So maintaining a certain amount of open space and daylight was absolutely essential, while also increasing the amount of units that they could fit on the site. And so what we were able to do was evaluate their existing scheme, but then also come up with more massing schemes that increased both the daylight and improve the number of units on the site. So from that, we were able to find an estimated increase in net profit of 176 million. and almost 300 more residential units, which is a big, really important to both this development, but also the city. In another use case, we work with many different development types. In this particular case, this is working with a mixed use district. And here we're able to improve the project yield as well as their views to existing parks and existing water. So you see here, a lot of what we do allows you to see in a more quantifiable sense the performance across many different aspects that usually would be evaluated by different teams, and sometimes in a much more subjective manner. So in this case, we really looked at the potential for increasing the value of the site through things like the views from particular apartments and how that integrated with their financial model. All right, I think I will close there, but excited to talk about any questions you all have. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you so much, Violet, for sharing what Delve does with this group a little bit. I'd like to lead us off with a question about customizability. When you showed the KPI slide, it sort of mentioned that these KPIs are evolving and customizable. And I actually think that the potential influence of generative design technology, whereby you let the computer essentially search through thousands, if not millions, of design iterations and evaluate them against the KPI, is a very, very powerful technology for many applications, not only sort of perhaps real estate quantification. But can you talk a little bit about that aspect, the customizability? I could imagine folks who are working, let's say, on a landscape design and have a very specific set of KPIs could customize the technology to look for landscape solutions, and somebody else who's working in affordable housing could look for how could I, within these regulatory constraints, fit as much affordability into this project as possible. And to what extent do you think Delve is going that direction?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a really important piece for us. And from the developments we've been working with, we see a lot of common denominators across projects where it turns out people care about how much can I fit on this site. They care about walkability. They care about open space and daylight access. But there's this nuance, like you're talking about, of specific things various teams care about. One's, yeah, they're an affordable housing developer and they really want to understand the affordable housing tax credits and how many affordable units can I fit on the site. Another really cares about walkability and they want to see it in a particular way or with specific KPIs. So one thing we try and do is find what is the common denominator so that we can really codify that so that teams can spend more time thinking about that customizable sweet bit, the unique percentage. So right now with projects that are extremely custom, we do engagements, basically more of a service model, working very closely with them to develop their specific metrics or KPIs. Mm-hmm. And we're working on as well this self-service product, which is a bit more standardized and also a bit more broad and accessible, that will be a bit more off the shelf.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And just a few years ago, actually, we had a chance to collaborate a little bit on some of those KPIs with a group here at MIT. But I think it evoked a series of really interesting questions that in much of quantitative urban analytic work, what tends to get measured first are things that are already measured or are easy to measure, relatively speaking, right? So for instance, sun exposure is a very common thing because there's great off-the-shelf methods for doing that, or water runoff, or maybe even profit from a real estate development perspective, because there is a quantitative formula for highest and best use, etc. But urban design also has, as we all know, a whole range of very hard to quantify things when we evaluate proposals. And so I'm curious, to what extent is it possible with this sort of tech to actually expose the kind of nuts and bolts of, okay, here's the kind of working framework, here's the OS for what generative design in Delve can do, and can people attempt to create their own KPIs? Is there kind of a hope that this would, that the KPIs themselves would perhaps even open up and anyone can write their own, or do you think it's way too complicated to get to that point where you can have people come up with their own KPIs and customize it in every possible way, that it has to be handled by a core team?
I think at this point, we're still relatively early on to where some of that kind of broad access that you're talking about, we're just not there yet. Like, we're still kind of ramping up to just starting to do pilots of our self-service product to better hone in on some of the more standardizable bit. But I think the intent is right where your head's at long term, which is if you look at the developments happening in the world today, the majority of developments that happen are actually informal or unplanned. And a lot of that has to do with not everyone can go out and hire SOM or KPF. Architects are expensive, actually. And so one thing that's really important, or that we think is important, is making development more accessible longer term to more people. So that is the intention, is that longer term this is something that would be more accessible, and thus something that can really be customized to different local environments where people will need to customize it. But at this point, it's just early.
I have one third question before we turn it into the summaries of what questions are coming in from our audience here, which is that when folks hear for the first time of generative design, there's oftentimes this sentiment of, are we trying to replace the human? Is it trying to replace what is fundamentally human and should not be automated? And I've heard many interpretations of an answer to that question. And when I see generative design outcomes, my first reaction is that, well, this is not really a design scheme per se. It's a sort of like a very, very early stage iteration that could be used to actually kind of write a brief for a design project. It would search through a lot of bad options and kind of narrow in where maybe the good options lie. But then from there on, it would be a human-driven process. Others have said that, it's almost fully automated for design. I'm curious where you stand on that spectrum. What's the sort of role where the automation process of generative design actually fits into the longer political, contested, multi-stakeholder process of actually deciding what design ought to be and for whom and how?
Yeah, totally. I love this question. And I feel like we're not the product where you're going to click a button and print a design that then gets 3D printed on the development site. It's not as packaged, and intentionally, because we want more humans in the loop. We want people to really use their creative juices to come up with what the right design is. So we like to say, like, we want to elevate people to their highest and best potential of creativity by automating things like laying out parking and stacking number of units. One story I like, or like association I like to share that's related to this is what happened in the film and animation space with like Pixar. And when that first came out, folks were understandably really concerned about what was going to happen to all of the animation jobs and illustrators' jobs. When you have things like Pixar and these animation studios, what were going to happen to all of the illustrators' jobs? All these creative folks that were thinking about developing movies. And what we saw was something which I think we're just starting to embark on with generative and computational design in the in our field, which is what actually ended up happening in animation was you ended up having people that would specialize in character development, people that would specialize in world building and in the environments, people that would focus on the storyboarding access or the storyboarding part of the narrative. And so really what you saw was changing of jobs. And you can argue that there are certain, I think with any new type of technology, there are things that are gained and things that are lost in that change. So, there are old animated movies that were frame by frame and someone drew them out. And there are creative aspects that maybe we don't see in new movies, but there are also new types of creative generation that come from 3D animation studios. And I think in many ways, like, we're going through that same process. So we're going to see jobs change, and we're going to see architects and developers that once focused on a particular part of the process be able to perhaps have more broad spanning roles or step out a little bit and allow for things like drawing out the parking or coordinating back and forth between the financial model and the 3D model. And that won't take up their time anymore, so that they can think more creatively, higher level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I think. And if I remember correctly, in fact, generative design and the early L systems work actually was very much influenced by the movie industry, who tried to create artificial cities without having somebody work them out in detail. So there's already that back and forth with Hollywood, I think, in this parametric or generative design world. But I very much empathize also with this idea that perhaps if somebody's going to put up a big RFP for an urban design project, let's say a brownfield redevelopment, et cetera, that as part of the homework before actually releasing the brief, somebody's already done some generative work in the background and narrowed in on all the sort of possible ways that actually some certain sea level rise constraints can be satisfied on that site, or certain affordability things can be fit within the regulatory constraints on the site, and then those become part of the brief. So in other words, it could help the brief become a lot more intelligent than just a completely open-ended world where every team would have to go through the same work, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like that's why this early phase development is so useful.
Great. I'd like to invite Sylvia to introduce some of what's come up in the chat from the Q&A so far. So maybe we can turn to that.
Sure, Andres. Thank you to our audience for their engagement with comments and questions, by the way. Well, after this brilliant session with Violet Whitney, first of all, what's Dell's definition and measurement for sustainability and also for risk?
Yeah, so I'd say risk is more encompassing. Like, risk includes all the aspects that we're measuring for. So that has to do with unit counts, that has to do with being constrained to local zoning, that has to do with assessing views, daylight, walkability, sun hours, construction cost, capital value, and sustainable metrics. It's like really has to do with, is the project viable in the market? Can it be built? Does it abide with regulatory, and can it be approved by the city? So I think that's really what risk means to us. From a sustainability lens, this is really things like GHG, solar, baseline energy, transportation. But I think maybe even more broadly is the assumption that we need to develop, and maybe this is like a bit more less of a hard metric and more of just like a general approach to development. We know that development is happening and needs to happen to house our growing population, and the pressure on cities and towns to really support new housing and new development and new uses. And we think it's really important as we're doing that, that we're thinking about the longevity of those developments. So longevity meaning that we've actually assessed it for not just those hard sustainability metrics like GHG and solar and baseline energy or construction cost. We also want to make sure that we've ensured the quality of life is good, that it has enough open space, that it's walkable, that it has daylight, but also that it's going to work long term, that it's viable in the market. And so I think it's really about taking this, sustainability is really about taking a long approach, making sure that you've assessed all the possible things that could be developed there and thinking about how well it will perform across many different aspects before you develop it.
Thank you. Trying to wrap up many questions. From a quality of life assessment, how much do typical urban design factors like active street life, connecting to outside assets, and vistas from public space, both on and off the site, are considered?
Yeah, so a lot of the existing amenities are really important to the development, the developments that Delve works on. So, our daylight and views really have to do with the impact, but based on the surrounding existing site. So where parks are and where existing buildings are, as well as walkability. So when we're placing amenities on the site, we're assessing the walkability to existing amenities that exist in the surrounding neighborhoods. So I'd say it's really important is assessing a lot of what is already there in the surrounding neighborhoods.
On a more technical question, is Delve based on a rule-based modeling or machine learning, or both, maybe?
Yeah, both. Both is the short answer. But yeah.
Yeah, follow-up question. Is the methodology employed by Delve available? Perhaps not the actual code, but the indicators and so
on. Do you know what specifically?
The main indicators used, like flood risk maps and heat maps, and daylight indicators.
Like we have all the types of metrics that Delve uses publicly on our website. I'm not sure if that's what you mean specifically, but
maybe it's a little bit about just the sort of nuts and bolts of the KPIs that go into the generative algorithms, like how is there documentation on, like, let's say highest and best use, or let's say daylighting, like how exactly you compute it? Is that open?
Yeah, we have that accessible to everyone that uses Delve. I don't know if we have public documentation for each aspect on our website. We essentially have like a glossary or table of contents for every single metric. And so when someone does a pilot project with us, and when you're actually in Delve, you will have access to every single breakdown of each metric and what it's made up of. I think maybe that documentation lives within Delve. So I don't know that it's if that piece is publicly available. Yeah.
Thank you. We have two more candidate questions, I would say. What does the Delve team look like? Do urban planners and architects work with software developers?
Yes, the Delve team is amazing. I'm just one mini little part of the team. We're about 50 people-ish. We are, there's a lot of architect computational design types. So a lot of folks that have spent time in architecture or development, but then gone into technology. And so really excited that there's computational design is now a official role within Google that Google hires for us, which is like personally a huge milestone. Excited to like, it lends it some, it's kind of like a real thing now. It exists at Google. So that's one piece of the team, and they work really closely with software engineers. So our software engineers span from all types. So software engineers that really work on infrastructure and cloud, to folks that really work on geometry and mapping and the back end, and folks that really work on the front end and usability. We have UXR, we have product designers, and they're really thinking about the value and a customer's real use with the product. We have product managers like myself, really focused on the business case. And then we have a sales team. A lot of the folks in sales have worked in real estate development or in design. Let's see, who am I missing? Yeah, wide spectrum. So a lot of like kind of crossover where folks have worked in many different fields. And there's a lot of, it's just continual learning. The sales team is always kind of teaching us about what they're learning. The architects are really educating the software engineers on what they mean when they talk about, you know, a good street wall design. So that's really interesting. I think there's like a lot of opportunity by just bringing these fields together under the same roof, when maybe at some point they might have been all living under different companies.
Thank you. Will Delve's analytical models will continue to be a closed source, or will in the future parts of it will be an open tool?
Sorry, say that again.
Will Delve's analytical models will continue to be a closed source, or will in the future parts of it will be an open tool, or will it be available?
I think too early to tell. At this point, we're doing pilots of self-service, and always looking for people that are interested in trying it out or demoing. So if you are interested, or if you know of someone who might be interested, do reach out via our website, Delve, what is it? Delve at Sidewalk Labs, Delve at Google. I always just Google Delve, delve.sidewalklabs.com, yes. So yeah, we're currently doing pilots, not yet open, not yet sure about the future. We're still in the learning phase of these pilots.
Thank you. Actually, a lot of people were asking about if it's free to use for MIT students or for personal use.
Yeah, not yet. I'm sorry. We're still too early on for that. But if you're really interested in testing, there's a potential there. So do reach out via the website.
Violet, can I maybe quickly build on one of those thoughts earlier, which is the general world of potential for generative design. So Delve is a particular product and it's fairly advanced. There's real use cases. There's other products out there that do very analogous things with different software tools. But so far, the exploration we've sort of talked about is within kind of a site planning, massing realm. It's sort of fitting a particular program with certain KPIs and configuring it spatially onto a bounded site. But I actually see a lot of potential also in all kinds of problems with constraints. So essentially, it's a search and optimization world, right? That you may have, let's say, a regulatory constraint, and you can search for solutions within regulatory constraints generatively, computationally, by just basically iterating through lots and lots of different possibilities. And do you see that in Delve? So is it kind of being created as a site design tool, as a kind of integrated pipeline, or do you see that some of the core algorithms that deal with constrained optimization are also kind of being considered for other purposes, like, I don't know, I see Sarah is on the call, for instance. She's worked on zoning in New York, right? Like what's possible within that zoning envelope? Or first step is to constrain what zoning looks like. It's a separate question, like what can you actually do within that? That's more of a generative design problem. But I can see a lot of examples, like your parking examples, that are very custom within a very small problem with custom constraints, but help a human find solutions that are hidden in really complex permutations that one can customize it. So the question of like, do you think the world is moving, and the Google team also is moving towards kind of having a core set of approaches to generative design that can end up in actually different domains, not only site configuration?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think right now the focus we have is really around this specific use case, mostly because just neighborhood development, city development is in and of itself a really complex problem that has a lot that needs to be explicitly codified to understand it. But I think the broader point you're making, which is really important, also really resonates, which is computational design and these methods like generative design are so broadly applicable. And we're seeing things pop up everywhere with, now places like the New York City Planning Department is hiring computational designers, and you see like Adidas is hiring computational designers. So it can be applied to all kinds of different problems. And so we're not yet at a point where I think, because each one of those problems is distinct enough, we're not yet seeing a more generalized product or platform that just says, okay, do generative design for everything. I mean, there are things like Galapagos and Grasshopper that like are really generalized generative design platforms. But I think the opportunity within each particular type of problem, like neighborhood development or city development, is that within that, there's a lot of room for really specifying the uniqueness of those types of problems that warrants maybe its own application. And So I don't know longer term. I can imagine like more broadly applicable, like a broadly applicable method or product that would span many. But I think it's kind of going to be both. You know, you might have something that's more cross-cutting, but you're still going to need, each one of those problems is so unique. And there are experts that like dedicate their life to just, you know, even one facet of the problem where, you know, like someone just focused on zoning and someone just focused on the financials. And so just bringing that piece together is like a meaty problem that requires its own codified focus, if that makes sense.
Back to you, Sylvia. If there's any other audience questions we can bring up.
I think we have covered most of them for today's session. Thank you.
I see a question up by Michael Allen about interior design. So this is also when software products are built early on, often have spatially these core decisions on how parent-child relationships between objects are structured have fundamental influence later. And I remember when, for instance, CD Engine that Esri brought up came about, there were very, very specific reasons why certain things, you know, you can do and certain things you can't do, because that's how it was conceived around, you know, streets determine parcels, parcels determine buildings. There was hierarchical relationships all the way down to detail. There's a question about interior use. How open is the framework? Can Delve be used to configure things interior? Can somebody, I don't know, lay out furniture with Delve, for instance?
Yeah, we don't yet lay out furniture, but we do do interior layouts for residential. So I think at this point we focus at the larger scale, just because we've been really focused on the neighborhood scale. But I do think that there's potential to get into those greater levels of granularity. And strangely enough, my partner used to be the head of product for a product named Floored that got bought by CBRE. If anyone knows this product, that's essentially what they did, was like generative design for interior layouts. They did test fits for commercial properties. So there's definitely products out there that focus on the automation of design within the interiors. I think it's just, it's maybe like a second phase of development where we're at a more conceptual, lower res phase, if that makes sense.
Got it. Yeah. I see Sarah Williams has a hand up. Sarah.
Hi, so happy that you're here talking with us today. And I thought I'd ask like maybe a bigger question. Just thinking about, and maybe this is something you can't answer, but I'm going to shoot for it anyways. But, like there has been so much excitement about civic technology, and, everybody was so excited for Sidewalk Labs to get started. And now it's inside Google, which is great, in the work that you're doing. And do you think this speaks for a trend more like, I guess, broadly, that, how are we working with civic technology? Is it happening like in smaller startups, or is it happening in like bigger organizations? And I know the particular sidewalk case was, a bit to have to do with Dan Doctoroff and his illness, but just kind of wondering your kind of larger trends that you're seeing in this area, and how do tech companies and how do these kinds of civic technologies get started?
Oh, yeah. It's a great question. I'm trying to think of like, I'm sure there's many opinions here. One thing that I feel like I've seen many different things. So it's, this is the first time I've like even thought about it, honestly. But I think I've seen a lot of really successful small startups around the space I've been working in. So even folks that like will start out of MIT and start some little project, and you're like, oh, that's cute. And then like, 2 months later, you're like, oh, wow, they have a whole product and like, they have just like gone to the races and got so far. And then you also see, like I've seen a lot of research projects that have been funded by, like by a certain grant or by the government. And those have gotten some traction. And then we're in this like, within this larger umbrella of Google. So it's hard to say like, if there's a particular trend, because I still see a lot of different types of technologies in this space that have really taken off and found decent footing. And it feels like a pretty eclectic ecosystem where a lot of things have been able to find success, but I guess it's relatively early. Sorry, that was a very muddy answer.
I know, as I threw it out thinking it would be a hard answer. That's why I said it might be hard. But I was just thinking, well, that's very encouraging to the students, of course, who like lots of them here listening to you today are actually thinking about like, what can I do to contribute to this area and how do I get started and how can I learn from what Delve has done and thinking about the development of technology for urban designers. So it sounds like it's happening at all angles.
Yeah, I certainly see people around the room here who are active participants in that realm. So it's a vibrant community, and we hope to play a key role in that at MIT as well. I just want to be mindful of folks' time. We promised to end at 1:30, which we're almost at. I would like to really thank Violet and give her a round of applause for starting us off on a great talk for the semester. Thank you so much. We'll share the chat and the questions that didn't get to the conversation orally, but you'll get to see them individually. And I'm also posting to the chat the ad for next Monday. We'll have Meta Berghauser-Pond, professor from Sweden, who will talk about pedestrians in urban design and how they can be quantitatively modeled and taken into account when we talk about urban design. So please join us again next Monday at 12:30. There's a separate registration link. And again, Violet, thank you so much. If you're available, please hang on the line and we can chat for a little bit before cutting out.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Bye, guys.